The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network.
On our southern border, victory has continued to follow the American standard, the bold and skillful operations of Major General Jackson, conducting troops drawn from the militias of the states least distant, particularly of Tennessee, have subdued the principal tribes of hostile savages, and by establishing a peace with them, preceded by a recent and exemplary chastisement, has best guarded against the mischief of their cooperation with the British enterprises which may be planned against the quarter of our country. James Madison, Annual Message, 20th of September, 1814.
To the officers and soldiers who have lately returned from the expedition to the Tallapooza. Fellow soldiers, you have, in a few days, opened your way to the Tallapooza and destroyed a confederacy of the enemy, ferocious by nature and grown insolent by the impunity with which they had so long committed their depredations. They knew not what brave men could effect when they came to chastise an insolent foe. Barbarians! They were ignorant of the influence of civilization and of government over the human powers. The friends of the Tallapooza will no longer murder our women and children or disturb the quiet of our borders. Their midnight flambeau will no more illumine their council house or shine upon the victim of their infernal orgies. They have disappeared from the face of the earth. Andrew Jackson, April 2nd, 1814.
If I had known that Jackson would drive us from our homes, I would have killed him that day at the Horseshoe. Junaluska.
When we left Andrew Jackson at the end of 1813 in episode 4.28, the general only had 130 men under his command defending Fort Strother in modern-day northeast Alabama. How then, you ask, was he talking about complete victory by the beginning of April 1814? That, dear listener, is the history that I'm going to share with you in this episode. Before I do that, though, I'd like to welcome you to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. Special thanks to Michael from the Quest for Power podcast, Nick from the Tennis podcast, and my co-host from the Vice Presidency Special Series, Alex, for providing the intro quotes for this episode. I told Michael when I reached out to him to read this opening quote that I'd finally found podcasters who had set themselves as equally ambitious of a task as I had for presidencies. Michael and his co-host Scott are on a quest to rate and review all the European monarchs from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire to World War I. Thus far, they have covered monarchs from the Kingdom of Toulouse, the Vandal Kingdom, the Ostrogoths, the Merovingian Franks, and a guy that you may have heard of named Attila the Hun. Check out Quest for Power wherever you get your podcast. Nick is a longtime friend of this podcast, and I cannot recommend the Tennis podcast enough, in particular the episodes where I served as the guest sidekick host. With each episode of his podcast, either Nick or his co-host comes with a list of tennis, get it, things on it, be it movies, companies, foods, presidents, or what have you, and the other person tries to guess what's on the list. Speaking as both a listener and a previous guest, it is so much fun, and it's a podcast I turn to when I need a pick-me-up, as Nick has a witty sense of humor that I admire and that is infectious. Explore the various top 10-ish lists that Nick and his sidekick host have covered to date by going to tennispod.com or searching for the Tennis Podcast wherever fine podcasts can be found. Last but certainly not least is my co-host and better half, Alex. It has been such a joy in the last year to be able to start recording with him, years into a journey that he helped inspire in the first place. As all of you have already seen, we laugh so much on a daily basis, and he fills my life with joy in so many ways. Je t'aime avec tout mon cœur, mon cher.
Greetings from Evergreen Podcasts. We're rolling out a listener survey, and we want to hear from you. The information in the survey will help us gather statistics and in turn make our shows more appealing to advertisers. I know most people don't like ads, but this is one of the only ways our shows make money and help keep their lights on. We promise it will only take a few minutes, but the impact on our podcasts will be tremendous. As a token of our appreciation, we'll randomly select one lucky participant each month to win an exclusive merchandise package from Evergreen Podcasts. Head to evergreenpodcast.com/listener-survey to help a show and possibly get some free stuff for doing so. We can't thank you enough for the support. Now back to the show.
Reports had reached Tennessee of the harsh conditions that had been faced by American forces engaged in the Creek War to that point, especially as some of the volunteer and militia troops whose enlistments had expired returned home and shared their stories. It'll come as no surprise to you to learn that people weren't clamoring to volunteer when they heard about the cold and hunger faced by the troops. Still, on December 27th, a force of around 800 recruits under Colonel William Carroll arrived in Jackson's camp. Sadly, this force was only enlisted for a term of 60 days. Tennessee Governor Wiley Blount wrote to Jackson urging him to, quote, abandon the campaign. Anyone who knows anything about Andrew Jackson knows that he wasn't about to do that. He had a force of nearly 1,000 under his command, and he intended to use them as long as he had them. He also asked Governor Blount for another 2,500 men from West Tennessee. He wasn't going to wait around for those, however, for Jackson had already determined his target and knew that every day was precious. Jackson had learned from intelligence sources of, quote, a very large fortified encampment of Red Sticks located in a horseshoe bend near the mouth of the Muckfall Creek on the Tallapoosa River. Jackson was convinced that this was the primary base of the hostile native forces. He may not be able to hold a position with men whose enlistments were so short, but he could raid the encampment and inflict some damage. Leaving only the bare minimum of a defensive force back at Fort Strother, by January 21st, Jackson and his men were setting up camp on a Muckfall Creek, but he soon learned that his arrival had not gone unnoticed. The next morning, at dawn, the native warriors attacked, but after an hour of fighting, the American force and native allies that had joined them from Talladega were able to repulse the attackers. Jackson sent his trusted lieutenant, General John Coffee, to attack the Red Stick encampment, but this offensive move quickly shifted back into a defense as Coffee and his men returned with the hostile natives right behind them. The second attack proved to be more challenging to push back than the first, and Coffee was injured in the battle, while Jackson's brother-in-law, Major Alexander Donaldson, was killed. Though the battle was won, Jackson realized that there was little more to be accomplished with the force at hand, so he returned to Fort Strother, ever wary each mile of the journey back of the possibility of an ambush by Red Stick forces. This third assault came while the Americans were encamped along Inochakopko Creek. When Jackson began to give commands to rally his forces, he found that his rearguard was in retreat. As Jackson biographer Robert Remedy described it, quote, Jackson, screaming orders in his high-pitched voice, managed to reform his columns and throw them hard against the Indians. He landed a solid blow. The general was described by a contemporary observer of the event, quote, as a rallying point for the troops, quote, firm and energetic, and at the same time perfectly self-possessed. His example and his authority alike contributed to arrest the flying and give confidence to those who maintain their ground. In the midst of a shower of balls, of which he seemed unmindful, he was seen rallying the alarmed, halting them in their flight, forming his columns, and inspiriting them by his example. The native force was repulsed, and the Americans discovered that they had only suffered a loss of 20 killed and 75 wounded, though some of these would pass away afterwards, while the native force lost approximately 200 warriors. As we've noted in previous episodes, any loss of life by the native army weighed much more heavily than American losses in terms of military strategy, as the Americans had a much larger reserve of replacements on the battlefield to draw from than the Red Sticks. Thus, though he hadn't achieved his goal, when Jackson returned to Fort Strother, he was in a much stronger position than he had been prior to the raid. Indeed, when news of these battles reached Washington, D.C., the Madison administration and other political leaders lauded Jackson's victory and took notice of this new general from the West. Likewise, the commanding general of American forces in the Creek War, General Thomas Pinckney, took particular notice of this campaign initiated and executed by Jackson. As described by historian Frank Lawrence Owsley, quote, Jackson's persistence in holding his army together and his determination to continue the Creek campaign to a conclusion had an important effect on Pinckney. The commanding general had gradually become convinced that Jackson was the best and most energetic general in the field against the Creeks. Indeed, having done all he could to push General John Floyd, the head of the Georgia troops, to go on the offensive before the enlistments of his army expired on February 22nd, you can only imagine Pinckney's frustration when Floyd wrote of a sneak attack on January 27th against his command that could have completely decimated his army had William Rutherford's plan been carried out properly by the native forces. No, Jackson was the key to bringing this conflict to an end, and General Pinckney knew that all Jackson lacked were proper resources in terms of men and supplies. Thus, from his command headquarters, he worked to make sure Jackson had everything he needed. In early February, the 39th Regiment, as ordered by Pinckney, arrived at Fort Strother, and they were soon followed by a cavalry brigade, a troop of dragoons, and a force of East Tennessee volunteers. By March, Jackson's command had swelled to 5,000 folks. While Jackson took time in February and early March training his new army, having the 39th Regiment of regular Army officers provided great support to the general, quote, to maintain a strong discipline, and Jackson would not think twice about applying, quote unquote, tough discipline if it would ensure that he could prevent the massive desertion and insubordination issues that he experienced the year prior with his command. He even brought up one of his generals, Isaac Roberts, up on charges when his force of around 200 men attempted to leave camp unless their term of service was shortened to 3 additional months. Jackson was roundly criticized for the execution of an 18-year-old private named John Woods, quote, for disobeying officers. Though technically the general was within his rights to do so, it was seen as unduly cruel punishment. The Woods execution had the desired effect, though. The men under his command knew now that Andrew Jackson was not one to be trifled with. On March 14, 1814, Jackson marched an army out of Fort Strother, leaving behind a defense of 450 men. For a second time, Jackson's intended target was the encampment at Horseshoe Bend, but circumstances now were much different than with Jackson's initial raid. As described by Romany, quote, the stronghold at Horseshoe Bend was actually a 100-acre wooded peninsula almost completely surrounded by water and with a stout breastwork running across its 350-yard neck. The breastwork was made of large timbers and trunks of trees laid horizontally on each other, leaving but a single place of entrance. It ran 5 to 8 feet high and had a double row of portholes artfully arranged to give the defenders complete direction of their fire. Because of the curvature of the breastwork, no army could advance upon it without being exposed to deadly crossfire. It was an engineering feat that surprised some white men who did not believe savage Indians capable of such skill. When Jackson arrived on the scene on March 27th and surveyed the native stronghold, he wrote to Pinckney that, quote, it is impossible to conceive a situation more eligible for defense than the one they had chosen, and the skill which they manifested in their breastwork was really astonishing. Still, Jackson was ready to meet the challenge. Jackson had ordered, quote, Coffee and his cavalry, along with the companies of spies and the entire force of friendly Cherokees, to occupy the side of the river opposite the bend in order to prevent the Red Sticks from escaping. And Coffee was to create a diversion to keep the defenders of Horseshoe Bend from realizing, quote, the principal point of attack until it was too late. At 10:30 a.m. on the 27th, Jackson's cannons opened fire, followed by, quote, musket and rifle fire. This continued for 2 hours, in the midst of which Coffee had folks cross the river to steal the Muskogee canoes to use for crossing the river for the assault. Then the diversion came in the form of a small force which, quote, set fire to the huts clustered at the turn of the bend and an initial assault on the defenders of the compound. As soon as the diversion was underway, Jackson ordered preparations for the main attack on the breastwork. Soon enough, the defenses were breached, and Jackson's men were in the compound. Indeed, one of the first Americans over the wall was Ensign Sam Houston, who is someone that is going to come up again in the podcast. As described by Remini, quote, "The Indians, stunned and frightened, backed away to conceal themselves in the thick brush that covered the ground. But the troops were after them and had the advantage of pursuit. The killing became savage, but the Indians asked no quarter and continued to fight even though they were hopelessly outnumbered." Even Jackson would later say that, quote, "The carnage was dreadful." Historian Howard Ware concluded that, quote, "However hard the Red Clubs resisted or their prophets prayed, once the barrier was taken, the battle, for all intents and purposes, was over." Though some Red Sticks wanted to continue the battle, hundreds of others looked for a way to escape across the Tallapoosa River, but General Coffee and his force loomed on the other shore, ready to engage if they tried to cross. For hours, Jackson's force continued to take down their native opponents, and Ware asserts that, quote, "The blood fever infected the troops like a virus. So intense was the bloodlust that even prominent officers of high rank went out hunting small coveys of Creek warriors concealed about the peninsula. Finally, it was down to one more fortified position, quote, at the end of the barrier, where a ravine contiguous with the trench emptied into the Tallapoosa. The Creeks had incorporated the ravine into their breastworks by roofing it with logs and cutting portholes through the wood arranged in such a way that every approach to the structure was covered. Jackson couldn't position his cannons to strike at this pseudo-bunker, so finally, the decision was made, quote, to burn them out. Again from Weir, quote, "Quickly, they gathered piles of brush, then tossed in lighted torches. The brush caught fire, and not long after, so did the logs of the creek refuge. Smoke began to roil out of the ravine as dozens of soldiers waited about the place, guns primed, for the sport to begin. One by one, then in groups, they began scurrying out of the burning bunker in all directions. Every Red Club was killed, some many times over, and scalped. Those few souls who made it to the river were cut down by Coffee's men on the opposite bank. Finally, it was done. The estimates of native warriors killed in the engagement ranges from 800 to 900, while Jackson's force suffered a loss of 49 killed and 153 wounded. This was a massive defeat for the Muskogee, one from which they would never recover. Before we continue on with Jackson, we need to check in on matters in the nation's capital, where Congress was working to force the president's hand on an important matter. As discussed in episode 4.27, Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin had been appointed the year prior as a special envoy to Europe to take up the Russian Tsar's offer to mediate in the American conflict with Britain, and had departed from American soil on May 9, 1813. The two problems that congressional leaders had with this was that Gallatin had not been confirmed by the Senate prior to his departure, and, with Madison's blessing, he had also not relinquished his post as Secretary of the Treasury. Senator Rufus King, Federalist from New York, led the attack, quote, charging that the president had no lawful authority to give Gallatin a diplomatic appointment while he remained Secretary of the Treasury. Designating Navy Secretary William Jones as acting head of the Treasury Department for such a lengthy period was also alleged to be illegal. The Senate demanded executive explanation of the administration's high-handedness and solemnly appointed committees to consult with the president. Madison's lengthy illness that summer deferred some of the attacks for a time, but once he started to recover in July, the Senate insisted, quote, that Madison confer with a Senate committee on the matter. Madison, however, replied that, quote, for him as the president to confer officially with a mere committee of the Senate lost sight of the independent and coordinate relations between the executive and legislative departments. He did agree to an informal meeting, but the committee found that Madison would only say, quote, that apparently he and the Senate had different understandings of the relations between them and would not offer anything more. Thus, the committee went back to the Senate, and in short order, they rejected Gallatin's nomination as a diplomatic envoy. They weren't completely unreasonable, however. The Senate sent back word to the president that they would, quote, confirm the diplomatic appointment if the president would declare the cabinet office vacant. This Madison refused to do, and there the matter remained when Congress adjourned and Madison returned to Montpelier in August, leaving Secretary Jones in charge of a good portion of the federal government back in Washington, as we discussed in his Seat at the Table episode. When Congress returned in December, however, Madison had cause to nominate Gallatin once more as a diplomatic envoy due to developments in Europe we'll discuss next episode. However, this time, the Senate was insistent. Either the post at Treasury was vacant, or he could kiss a confirmation for Gallatin goodbye. As the Senate had him over a barrel, Madison could do little more than to give his assent to the demand, and with the Treasury Department officially without a head, he had to go in search of a replacement. Madison had worked with U.S. District Attorney in Philadelphia, Alexander James Dallas, in mid-1813 to secure loans from bankers in that city, and knew him to have an able mind for finances. Thus, he initially offered the position to Dallas on February 1st, but Dallas refused, preferring to remain in Philadelphia. Never fear, dear listeners, you'll get your chance to learn more about Dallas both in the narrative series and in an upcoming Seat at the Table episode. Next, Madison turned to Comptroller of the Treasury Richard Rush as a possible replacement at Treasury, but Rush himself worked to dissuade such talk. He was loyal to Gallatin and felt that, quote, to succeed him in the place from which he had been so unceremoniously removed would be to appear to condone the treatment the Senate had meted out. Thus, when Madison asked, he declined as well. The president was now 0 for 2 in terms of replacements for Gallatin. Luckily, he had one more name on his list. We've mentioned Senator George Washington Campbell, Democratic-Republican from Tennessee, previously due to his role as chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee when he was in that body. You can learn all about Campbell in his Seat at the Table episode, but just know that he had been a staunch supporter of the Jefferson and Madison administrations while serving first in the House, then in the Senate. Thus, it makes sense that someone who was a supporter and who at least had some knowledge of the nation's finances from his work on Ways and Means would be third on Madison's list. Campbell did ultimately accept the post, and thus, on his birthday, February 9, 1814, he became the 5th U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. This meant that he was only the second person from west of the Appalachians to sit in the cabinet. This, however, was not the only vacancy that Madison had to fill. On January 5, 1814, in yet another check on the administration, Representative John W. Taylor, Democratic-Republican from New York, introduced a bill to require the Attorney General to reside in Washington, D.C. during congressional sessions to answer legal questions that may arise at the time. When William Pinckney had accepted the post just over 2 years earlier, it had been with the understanding that he would still be able to attend to his private legal practice, as was the case with everyone who had to that point assumed the part-time role of Attorney General. Thus, on January 25th, after word of the bill arrived, Pinckney wrote to Madison asserting that, quote, as I'm quite sure that my professional pursuits in Baltimore and Annapolis will render it impossible for me to comply with it, I beg leave to tender to you the resignation of my office. I need not assure you, sir, that I surrender up this appointment, as I accepted it, with a deep sense of gratitude for the proof of confidence which it implied, and that, although the official ties which bound me to you are now at an end, those of affection and respect will endure forever. As Pinckney's biographer Robert M. Ireland notes, quote, Pinckney's many absences from the capital no doubt greatly inconvenienced the President, Congress, and the other agencies which were dependent upon the Attorney General for legal advice. Though Madison reminded Pinckney that the bill had not actually become law yet, and indeed it ultimately wouldn't, he did accept his resignation, though he asked him, quote, to prolong your functions till a successor can be provided. Unlike his approach with the Gallatin situation, Madison did not drag his feet about searching for a new Attorney General. As he approached first Dallas, then Rush about the Treasury position, he dangled the opportunity to become Attorney General as well. For Dallas, the idea was absurd. If he was reluctant to leave Philadelphia to take over at Treasury, he certainly wasn't willing to accept a post that paid $2,000 less. For Rush, however, this was more of an opportunity. At $3,000 a year, the part-time post of Attorney General was nearly the same amount as he earned in his full-time role as Comptroller of the Treasury. As Rush's biographer J.H. Powell notes, this, quote, offered Rush a logical extension of the heavy burdens of legal prosecutions he had been carrying for more than a year anyway, and it enlarged his scope. Thus, on February 10, 1814, Rush assumed office as the 8th U.S. Attorney General. He remains, as of the time of recording in 2024, the youngest person to assume the office, as he was 33 at the time. The next youngest were one of Rush's predecessors, Caesar Augustus Rodney, and one of his distant successors, Robert F. Kennedy, both of whom were 35 when they became Attorney General. Naturally, you'll be able to learn more about Rush not only in the narrative series, but in his upcoming Seat at the Table episode. This was not the only change happening in the administration around this time, however. As he had done with a couple of other posts when he assumed the presidency, Madison had decided to continue Jefferson's Postmaster General, Gideon Granger, in his post. As we've discussed previously, Madison, like his predecessors, sought a geographic balance in his appointments, and New England in particular proved a challenge for Democratic Republicans. Thus, Granger of Connecticut was a recognized leader that Madison thought could help him to make inroads in that Federalist stronghold. However, Granger soon fell in with the anti-administration faction under the Democratic-Republican umbrella, dubbed the Invisibles, that included Senator Michael Leib of Pennsylvania. When the postmaster position in Philadelphia became free in early 1814, Granger decided to award it to Leib. Now, I'll pause this for a moment to go ahead and say what you're already likely thinking. Why in the world would someone who was a sitting U.S. Senator want to go from that office to being Postmaster of Philadelphia? I'll admit that I'm still trying to research Leib, about whom I thus far have not been able to find a good amount of information, so I'll ask you to take this with a grain of salt. As we've seen in this series, as well as the Seat at the Table series, service at the federal level often entailed a financial hardship for certain folks. So it could be that Leib was in a tough financial situation due to having served in the Senate since 1809 and being away from his home in Philadelphia. He could have been looking for a lucrative position in the federal government that would allow him to go home and attend to personal matters. And as Ketchum notes, the position of Postmaster of Philadelphia was, quote-unquote, profitable. Whatever the case, Granger had decided on Leib for the position, as was the traditional purview of the Postmaster General. Madison, however, was by this point ready to challenge the remaining Jefferson appointees. The president was not about to give his assent to the appointment in his name of someone who had made his first term a constant struggle. Pro-administration folks in Washington approached Granger about the idea of appointing Richard Bosch, the grandson of the revered Benjamin Franklin, as the Philadelphia postmaster. However, they found Granger unwilling to budge. Granger, meanwhile, appealed to former President Jefferson about the matter, hoping that he would side with him in the conflict. The Virginia friendship held strong, and Jefferson, quote, gave him, i.e. Granger, no encouragement in his plan to issue a public vindication. Despite hearing directly from Madison himself that he did not support this appointment, Granger still sent in Leib's appointment to the Senate. This would not stand, and thus, on March 17th, Madison fired Granger and appointed in his stead the governor of Ohio, Return J. Meigs, Jr., who had been a staunch supporter of the administration and the war effort. Beyond that, Meigs's daughter had recently wed an extended member of the Madison family and close confidant of the president, Representative John G. Jackson, Democratic-Republican from Virginia. It is clear that, in his second term, Madison was focused on consolidating his quote-unquote administration family by having trusted confidants in official posts. There is still some more work to be done on that front, as we shall see, but that will be a matter addressed in future episodes. In the meantime, let's return back to the aftermath of the Creek War. Prior to Horseshoe Bend, Secretary of War John Armstrong had appointed General Thomas Pinckney and Indian agent Benjamin Hawkins as the official government representatives to conclude a peace treaty with the Muskogee, and Pinckney was given latitude to draw up the agreement as he saw fit, so long as, quote, the Indians were to indemnify the United States for the cost of the war. In April 1814, Pinckney presented his terms to the native peoples with the hopes that his, quote, rather generous terms would induce the remaining hostiles to bring about a quick end to the war. However, considering the blood, sweat, and tears that Tennessee had poured into the conflict, they were not satisfied with the terms that Pinckney was offering and wanted a seat at the table. They would soon have it. Jackson, given his performance at Horseshoe Bend, was offered the rank of Brigadier General and a brevet promotion to Major General in the U.S. Army on May 22, 1814. He was to be assigned command of the 7th Military District, and, as his orders from Armstrong outlined, Jackson would take command of the negotiations with the Muskogee from Pinckney. It wasn't until July 10, 1814, that he was able to actually relieve Pinckney in the negotiations at Fort Jackson. But as soon as he arrived, he called for a meeting on August 1st. At that meeting, Jackson dropped the bomb. The United States was demanding, quote, about 22 million acres of land, more than half the area of the Creek Nation. The Muskogee were naturally angry, but they would find Jackson immovable. Thus, as Owsley notes, quote, they signed the treaty on August 9th and agreed not to block the surveying of the new territory. As a protest, they insisted that a copy of the mild terms, which had been sent to General Pinckney by the Secretary of War, be attached to the treaty when it was sent to Washington. One important point to note here, of the 35 native peoples who signed this treaty, there was, quote, probably only one who had been a Red Stick. The rest had been allies to the American cause for the duration of the Creek War. Despite that, with this treaty, the property rights to a majority of what is now modern-day Alabama and South Georgia was, quote-unquote, secured for white Americans, including lands that had been populated by the native peoples allied with the Americans. As Owsley notes, quote, if enforced, it, i.e. the Treaty of Fort Jackson, would break the power of the Southern Indians and clear millions of acres for use by the white man. Exactly as Jackson intended. While I don't like leaving you on such a down note, our time together is unfortunately drawing to a close. I should also warn you, dear listener, that there is going to be much more tumult awaiting us in the future. 1814 is a year of change in many ways, as we shall discuss in more detail in the next episode when we jump back over across the Atlantic to witness the dissolution of an empire. Until then, I'd like to thank Michael, Nick, and Alex again for reading the opening quotes for this episode. I'll have links for Quest for Power and the Tannish Podcast, as well as episodes of our Vice Presidency special series on the website, presidenciespodcast.com. There, you can also find sources used in this episode, past episodes of the podcast, links to information about all the presidents, and information on how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support the podcast. The monetary support provided by our patrons helps to offset the compensation provided to Christian for his audio editing work on this episode. Working with Christian over the years has been a pleasure, and I know when I send the audio over to him that I'm going to get back a quality product to share with all of you, while giving myself more time to focus in on the other aspects of podcasting, including research, writing, recording, and managing social media. If you would like to enlist Christian's audio editing skills for your podcast, go to yourpodcastpal.com to learn more about the services he provides. If you'd like to contribute to the Presidency's podcast on an ongoing basis, just go to patreon.com/presidencies to sign up, and you can join our latest patron, James. Thank you so much, James, as well as all of our wonderful patrons in not only keeping the podcast going, but also helping it to grow. There are perks at all the membership levels, but for those who contribute $10 or more a month, you're invited to participate in a monthly call where you can talk directly with me and ask any burning questions that you may have about recent episodes, U.S. presidential history, podcasting, or anything else that may come to mind. I can't guarantee that I'll have all the answers immediately, but it's always a wonderful conversation, and I cannot thank my top patrons enough for all their support and friendship. If you'd rather make a one-time donation, that option is available at buymeacoffee.com/presidencies. Ratings and reviews are also very welcome and a much appreciated way to show your support by telling others why they too should be listening to the Presidencies podcast. I can't thank those that regularly share information about the podcast enough. Word of mouth is such a key way of reaching new listeners and inviting them to join us on this journey through presidential history. If you'd like to reach out to me, please feel free to shoot me an email at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. Or you can connect with me on social media if you're not already. I'm available on Facebook, Mastodon, Post, and Blue Sky as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads at Presidencies Podcast. Our sincerest thanks also to the folks at the Colonial Music Institute at George Washington's Mount Vernon, who graciously allowed us the use of clips from Hull's Victory as performed by David and Ginger Hildebrand for our intro and outro music. You can find out more about the great work that the Colonial Music Institute is doing to research and share information about early American music and dance by going to mountvernon.org and typing in Colonial Music Institute in the search field. Last, but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. I've always enjoyed studying presidential history, but the experience took on a new dimension when all of you joined the journey with me. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Burn the Boats from Evergreen Podcasts. I interview political leaders and influencers, folks like award-winning journalist Soledad O'Brien and conservative columnist Bill Kristol, about the choices they confront when failure is not an option. I won't agree with everyone I talk to, but I respect anyone who believes in something enough to risk everything for it. Because history belongs to those willing to burn the boats. Episodes are out every other week wherever you get your podcasts.